Good evening, Canby, and welcome to our November 13th Canby Planning Commission session. We'll get started with our Pledge of Allegiance. Please join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much, and we'll get started. We have three consent items for this evening, and we will take those one at a time, starting with our first consent item, which is the draft meeting minutes for June 12th of 2023. We'll start with a roll call vote. I'm sorry, we'll start with a motion. Do we have a motion to adopt the meeting minutes?
I move that we adopt the moving minutes of June 12, 2023.
I'll second.
I second.
Very well. We will do a roll call vote, starting with Commissioner Driscoll.
Aye.
Aye.
Commissioner Jarosh.
Aye.
Aye.
Commissioner Hutchinson.
Aye.
Commissioner Ellison.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The draft meeting minutes for June 12th, 2023 are approved. Moving on to consent item number 2, final findings of DR 23-04 /CUP 23-02, the Public Works Fueling Facility. We have already done the oral decision. There's a part of our code that requires the written decision. We've all had a chance hopefully to review the written decision. It looks consistent with what we discussed and approved at our previous session. So again, by a roll call vote, we'll start with myself. I'm an aye. I'm sorry, we need a motion to, sorry. Can we have a motion, please, to approve the consent item, final findings, DR 23-04, CUP 23-02, Public Works Fueling Facility, as written?
I move that we approve DR 23-04 /CUP 23-02, Public Works Fueling Facility.
Second.
Okay, so roll call vote. Commissioner Ewert is an aye, is that correct? Commissioner Hutchinson?
Aye.
Commissioner Driscoll?
Aye.
Commissioner Jarosh?
Aye.
Commissioner Little Ellison?
Aye.
Commissioner Llewellyn?
Aye.
Very well. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is approved by 7-0. And we'll move on to our third consent item. Our third consent item is final findings, DR 23-05, VAR 23-02, the Beer Library Modified Project. Do we have a motion for the final findings of the Beer Library Project?
I move that we approve DR 23-05 /VAR 23-02, the Beer Library Modified Project.
I second.
All right, by a roll call vote, I will start with myself. I'm an aye. Commissioner Ewert?
Aye.
Commissioner Hutchinson?
Aye.
Commissioner Driscoll?
Aye.
Commissioner Jarosh?
Aye.
Commissioner Ellison?
Aye.
Commissioner Llewellyn?
Aye.
All right, the ayes have it. The DR 23-05, VAR 23-02 Canby Beer Library Modified Project is approved. Moving on to citizen input on non-agenda items. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on non-agenda items. Each person will be given 3 minutes to speak. Staff and Planning Commission will make every effort to respond to questions raised during citizens' input before the meeting ends or as quickly as possible thereafter. You may speak on non-agenda items via Zoom You must submit all comments to public comments at Canby, Oregon, public comments at cambyoregon.gov no later than 3 p.m. on the day of the Planning Commission meeting, and provide your name, the topic you would like to speak on, and your phone number. You will be sent a Zoom link to the meeting. Do we have any citizen input on non-agenda items? Very well. Moving on to new business, there is none. Public hearings, there is none. We will now move into the Planning Commission work session. The purpose of tonight's work session is to give the Planning Commission the opportunity to discuss the long-range planning update. To make the most of the short time we are given for these work sessions, public comment will not be taken. Instead, we invite public comment at all of the Planning Commission's regular meetings under either of the two opportunities dedicated on each agenda for public comment. In addition, we invite the public to contact city staff with comments or concerns. Although this is a public meeting, the Planning Commission cannot make any formal decision in a work session. Next step actions are often determined for deliberation and discussion at a properly noticed Planning Commission hearing. And with that, we will turn it over to Planning Director Don Hardy.
Good evening, Chair Ellison and Commissioners. Tonight, we're going to be going back through some information we previously discussed, but this is kind of consolidating a lot of that information and leading us into the Community Summit on November 14th tomorrow. There'll be more dialogue regarding scenario planning, which I think this is a good lead into that. I'll also talk about the listening session we had on November 6th for those property owners that are outside the current urban growth boundary that are potentially possible adds to the urban growth boundary, and some information regarding that as well. So with that, I'm going to go through the slides pretty quickly. I want this to be interactive, and if there are questions that you have while we're going through that, let me know. The intention here is to really try to talk about the steps kind of more on a macro level than to go into real fine detail, but just to let you know what's involved in this process. Near term for the comprehensive plan and transportation system plan, and then longer term for the urban growth boundary expansion and what that all means. So I kind of covered most of what I just covered was project overview, planning for growth, urban growth boundary expansion, vision and scenario planning, and next steps. You've seen this slide, I think, before. This is a general slide, and I have some more detailed ones, but this is the comprehensive plan for the city and its current urban growth boundary and the urban growth boundary expansion, kind of paralleling that process.
I need to turn this on.
Recording in progress.
Okay. I just want to click that. I'm going to continue here with the next slide. So the next slide will get into a little more detail, and what I really kind of want to focus on here is, again, transportation system plan, comprehensive plan, urban growth boundary expansion, and summit number 2, which is tomorrow at 6 p.m. at the Canby Police Station. For
Can we get Laney to move?
Laney, can you, do you have control of that up there? The slide.
Thank you.
Okay. Continuing the community summit tomorrow is summit number 2. There'll be summit number 3 and summit 4. 3 and 4 would be occurring in 2024, somewhere between probably February and June. Those dates have not been determined. Planning Commission and City Council briefings, that's what we're doing tonight. That's continuing. Project Advisory Committee is continuing. We don't have another Project Advisory Committee meeting date set yet, but we just had one recently. I'm guessing that'll be at the beginning of the year as well. And then there's a Transportation Technical Advisory Committee that also will be forming, that's going to be established here near term, that would start at the beginning of next year as well. So this is giving a little bit more information on the anticipated adoption process that we're looking at for transportation system plan, comprehensive plan, and urban growth boundary. and this is a little more specific. So housing needs analysis and housing production strategy, we're anticipating those items to be adopted by May 2024. And I'll cover this again a little bit later, but the housing needs analysis work session is December 11th with the Planning Commission, and that's coming up. Land efficiency measures is going to be anticipated to be adopted June 2024. There's a Planning Commission work session on November 27th for housing efficiency measures. And then the comprehensive plan for the city and the current urban growth boundary would be December 2024. The transportation system plan would be December 2024. Again, city limits and current urban growth boundary expansion. And then the urban growth boundary expansion process is initiated, and that process first has to be approved by the city after the comprehensive plan is adopted for the city and current urban growth boundary. The initiation of the urban growth boundary expansion happens. We're anticipating about 6 months for that process to occur from adoption of the comprehensive plan. The city first needs to adopt it, and then the county, Clackamas County, and the state DLCD need to adopt it. So that process, fully to adopt a new urban growth boundary expansion, is about a year-long process, bringing us to December 2025. This is a little bit more information here, and I'm going to go through these slides a little bit more in detail, but in terms of where we're at in the process, the first step in the urban growth boundary process, we've established the land need for the economic opportunity analysis. We have that's been adopted by the council, and the housing needs analysis has not been yet adopted, but is anticipated to be adopted by the council, as I mentioned, in May of 2024. And this gives the comprehensive plan and kind of articulates what's involved with the comprehensive plan and transportation system plan. And when we start to get into we're going to be planning for policies within the comprehensive plan and transportation system plan. The refined land need and an expanded urban growth boundaries has very specific parameters around that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail tonight, but Goal 14 and Oregon statewide Goal 14 requires an efficient accommodation of land need, provision of public utilities, an easy analysis to be completed, and compatibility with adjacent farm and forest uses. Those are items that have to be included as part of that process. That would be happening sometime next year as part of that process moves forward. And then that process then makes the way for what we call concept planning, which we have an urban growth boundary, it has comprehensive plan designations with it, but it doesn't have all the tools that are necessary to fully implement and build out those areas, which is required to have a wetlands inventory, also public facilities planning and infrastructure planning. So that's called concept planning post the urban growth boundary expansion, which would be something that we're anticipating to occur. At this point, we don't know if that's thematically through the entire city or specific areas that would be part of the urban growth boundary. Depending on how close they are to the city limits and utility service, et cetera, that'll have to be worked out. And then codes would be updated as well for the comprehensive plan and future urban growth boundary areas. One of those, just for example, I think that we're in need of is a parks public facility designation that would cover parks, public facilities, and it would cover a multitude of different things, but currently we really don't have a zone that actually addresses that, and so we have a kind of de facto analysis that we have to do as minor and major public facilities. I see that as a need because I think it would help those properties that are designated single-family residential now, and most of them are, whether you're a school, the fairgrounds, the public works center, operations center, or parks, most of those are zoned single-family residential. And then we get to the annexation part, once the development codes are in place, and that would be required to really have those tools in place. So annexation would involve, once the urban growth boundaries defined, annexation would be required to bring it into the city and zone it appropriately according to the comprehensive plan designation. There'd also be a development concept plan that would have to go with that process. For those people that are anticipated that might get included in the urban growth boundary expansion, we made this point fairly detailed, is that just because you're in the urban growth boundary expansion area does not mean that you will be annexed to the city. That is clearly your decision as a personal property owner. That's completely up to the individual property owner to do that, whether they want to annex or not. Doesn't change your tax rate when you are included in the urban growth boundary expansion. I confirmed this with Clackamas County. So that's one of those items that came out of the listening session. So that kind of covers that piece of it. Just as a timeline on the urban growth boundary expansion piece, I wanted to go through a little bit of the detail, but not so much that we're going to spend all night going through this. But so again, establishing the need for housing needs analysis and economic opportunity, that would again would be the acreages that are needed for the anticipated acreages that are needed for employment and housing. I'm going to go through those briefly. I'm assuming there may be a question on that. So for industrial, on the economic opportunity analysis, it's around 440 acres. Commercial is about 8 acres. Residential is being evaluated, but it's somewhere in the range, we believe, at this point, of 50 to 100 acres. Parks is probably in the 60-acre range, and parks would include things like sports complexes as well. Schools, police, and fire have not yet been completely determined, but that's another element. We're trying to work with the school district about their plans for their future growth, and this would again be in the urban growth boundary area, in specific the area that would be added to the city. So then there's efficiency measures, and that's part of our November 27th work session on housing efficiency measures. And just to remind everyone regarding those are cottage developments, plan unit development revisions, and provisions for allowing a different mix of housing in highway commercial zones. Those are the three. Those are being worked through, and on this Friday, you should be receiving a packet that has draft code in it. I know it's a little odd to go through code in a work session, but we'd like to provide that to the Planning Commission to get your initial thoughts on the efficiency measures and the details. So we're starting to dive into code, and we'll go through a full presentation on November 27th on those items. Efficiency measures are a tool that the state uses and requires for cities to be able to do urban growth boundary expansion. In other words, they are looking to make sure you're using your land most efficiently, and it's specifically targeted to housing. It's not targeted to employment. And so there's a creation of the preliminary and final study area that I'll kind of go into with some more slides here about the urban growth boundary and the exclusions to those, and then prioritization of land. That gets into the type of farming activity that occurs out there, the type of soils, the impact of farming, et cetera. And so those are other items that we'll be covering at a high level tonight. So the preliminary study area is all lands that are designated as urban reserve. Canby has none, and all lands within 1 mile of the current urban growth boundary. So it's a huge area, and I'll have a map here that I'll bring up. So the preliminary study area, this is a circle around the city, 1 mile around the city. You have those areas in brown that are undesignated lands that were established, identified by the legislature. Those are areas that could be potentially brought into the city. There are areas in green that are rural reserve. They cannot be brought into the city. They are protected lands. And you have the other categories as well cannot be brought into the category of the gray areas. So this is kind of a blow up of the brown areas around the city and kind of what we have to work with. So the study area can exclude certain lands, those that are impractical to provide, that don't have necessary public facilities or services, have significant development hazards, could be steep slopes, et cetera, consist of scenic, natural, or cultural recreational areas, are owned by the federal government and managed for rural uses. Key issue here is that study area needs to be at least twice the acreage of the land needed for the deficiency. So with that in mind, this kind of breaks it down. You can see all the colors here: green, yellow, orange, purple, and blue. And that is roughly about 1,553 acres of land. There's about a need of about 608, probably 608 to roughly, I'd say 625 is the need, and that's a rough estimate, but it's definitely twice as much. So part of this gets into where, based on the housing needs analysis and economic opportunity analysis, where would employment lands most likely be appropriate? Where would residential lands be appropriate? Where would potentially things like parks, and again, we're not citing these specifically, but acreages, where might those areas be identified for park areas, sports complex areas, schools, police, fire, those kinds of items. So I'm going to get into the visioning. This is going to be covered a little bit tomorrow night as well, and some of this you've heard already. In 2043, I'm not going to go into the exact text here, but essentially the themes are housing for all, supportive and welcoming community, diverse and prosperous economy, resilient public infrastructure, network of connected green spaces. And the mapping tomorrow night is going to go through an exercise where there's pens, papers, stickers, and these actually have definitions around them about residential, what the chips represent, residential, employment, lands. There'll be an opportunity to talk about parks and those kinds of things where we want the public's input as to where they see, based on our needs, again, housing needs and economic opportunity, as to where we're at now, where should those areas be identified as the future, including the potential urban growth boundary expansion area. And that is digitized into a format and brought back. It's part of our scenario planning that will be brought back into Housing Summit 3. Some upcoming dates, again, I'm kind of repeating myself. We have the Cultivating Canby Summit number 2, Planning Commission Housing Efficiency Measures, again, November 27th, and the Planning Commission Work Session on Housing Needs on December 11th. This is the postcard. I'm now going to transition into the listening session that we had on November 6th. This is the postcard that went out. I would say it was very well received in the fact of the people that showed up. We had an overflow room, and we almost got to the point where we needed to use it, which is the Willamette room here. Very civilized conversation. Obviously, people are, concerned, but I think they were more there to take in input than to react. And that is recorded. We're trying to get that on the website. It's way too big to email. I found that out when I tried to send it to somebody, and it was just, I can't do it. So we're trying to post it, but there was a full recording of that. It went about 3 hours. It was supposed to be 2 hours, but it went about 3 hours. So it was, and people came up afterwards after the information was provided. So really good attendance, and I would say that's going to be reflective of tomorrow night. We're bringing in a ton of chairs to accommodate that. It is going to be somewhat tight quarters because even though the police station the community room is large, it's, we're going to have big huddles around each table. So hoping to be able to accommodate the crowd. We did not have as many the first summit, but I'm anticipating this group is very interested since we initiated a conversation with them on that. And that's really what I've got, to share. If you guys have questions about items and what might come up tomorrow night, I'm happy to answer those.
Commissioner Jarosh, do you have anything?
I just had a question out of curiosity. I think I might have misunderstood something, but Don, you were talking about property tax changes. And so if somebody is EFU, so they have low property taxes, if they're brought into the growth boundary, does the EFU designation change, or how does that work?
No, it does not. The base zone stays the same. The sovereignty remains with the county. It's not city property. So we have that current situation now, actually, in areas that have not been brought into the city. They're in the urban growth boundary, but they're regulated by Clackamas County. They're not subject to City of Canby control or ordinance.
But if somebody chooses to annex their property to the city,
Then they are subject to city ordinances and everything else that goes with that. I mean,
Okay.
so it's really a choice in this situation. And what's ironic about it is that even though it's been 39 years since we did the last comprehensive plan, some of those urban growth boundary areas still have not been brought in. So this is a long-term play as to like when property might come in, and just, you could see, my point tonight was really the steps that are involved. It's a multi-year process just to get to the boundary adoption, and then to get into the details and concept planning is probably another year out from that. So it's not an easy thing to do. I think a lot of jurisdictions, that's probably why they're not doing it. It's pretty challenging to do. I think for Canby, essentially, we're running out of land, and the state requires us to plan for a 20-year horizon.
right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
What are some of the benefits of annexation? Like, why would somebody want to annex into Canby?
I think primarily, if you're interested in developing your property, I mean, that probably would be the main thing. I think that's really the issue here. We have a need. If somebody wants to tap into that, that really is it. I think it's really about, do you want to be part of an more urban environment than a rural environment? I mean, that really is probably the main benefit.
Does that change their police and fire service access as well then?
It would. They would have City of Canby police, absolutely, if they were
Fire,
annexed.
where now it's
Yeah, and fire,
County.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right, so it's more than that, though. When you look at the industrial properties, when you look at the farmland you're bringing in for industrial properties, a lot of those guys didn't necessarily want to develop. They just were stuck, because the minute you expand that growth boundary, you've frozen that future use, and it's not farm anymore. Those farms and houses become very worthless. You're selling that property based on the value of its industrial piece. So it's about estate planning for those guys. And I think when we talk about annexation, I don't want to get too deep in the woods tonight, but we need to see a process. The city needs to have a process for people for annexation. And I want to have a good discussion about the pros of having the city be the lead applicant. Give them a one-time shot. When you bring those properties in as a whole, the city has more control. And that was fought and fought and fought. We need to have a serious discussion on annexation and the ability for property owners, whether it's today or 10 years from now, to be able to annex that in and not be stuck because all of a sudden no growth just decided they didn't want it. And then these people are stuck. These property owners, when you change their zoning, they're stuck out there. They have to get annexed in. And if you have a big push against it, this isn't cool, I'm telling you. We need to have a serious discussion on this annexation process before I'm going to approve it.
And I would, just a couple comments on that. I think, first, the annexation process has changed significantly over the years. I mean, it used to be a voter-approved item. I mean, it is no longer voter-approved. I mean, if you're consistent with your underlying comprehensive plan process, and you have utilities that will provide service to those areas, it will be approved. I mean, period. I mean, that's what the current annexation process says. You do have to do a development concept plan because the city wants to know where our street's going to go, where are utilities going to go, and that's an appropriate ask on our end for the city to know what that is, so that tax dollars are being spent wisely as to where things are going to go and function. I think that I would say, would it change people's perception on their ability to bring their property into the city, that they did not have that option before? Yes. Would it prevent them from farming? Absolutely no. I mean, I'm going to disagree with that to some degree, because, I mean, just because you're in the urban growth boundary doesn't mean you have to stop farming.
No, I didn't say it. I didn't mean that at all.
Yeah.
You can continue farming, continue to stay in EFU, but when you get along in life and you have your house and your farm's bringing you $40,000 a year, and now all of a sudden you're 80 years old. You have to have a process to get out of there. You're not going to sell that farm to somebody else. You're not going to do that, right? Nobody's going to buy that as a farm like that.
And I like where your commentary at the beginning on successional planning for your estate planning is what you called that. I got a very strong sense, and again, I'm reading the room from November 6th, but I think there are many people that are thinking about that, because they've reached a point in their career and their journey in life that they're contemplating those issues about what does this mean? That's my belief. So I think that is an important element.
Yeah, and when you go to approve this thing, there needs to be a plan for the financing mechanism, public-private partnership, and having that, what can they tap into? And I think having the city be the lead in that annexation process gets them out of those back taxes. That allows them to have more of a partnership financially on the private side. This was fought during our time. So I think having that process, having those properties know what they can go for, and know in 20 years they're not going to be fought on it because it's a different body sitting in here, is vital for the success.
And I think that to some item that are part of that are interwoven, I think my hope is that we do the urban growth boundary piece, and then the concept planning piece, I think, goes hand in hand with what you're speaking to, which is doing more master planning, and maybe the role of the city is greater in that versus us waiting for people to initiate that process, and that would be a council discussion. But I think the concept planning would at least lead to some of those discussions, there's not clarity on this at this point, and that would help with that, which is the public-private partnership and what infrastructure is paid by who in that process as that goes through. What is the relationship between the city and the property owner? Probably some issues similar to the industrial park, like Sequoia being built by the city and then the other roads being built by developers in the current industrial park. I mean, that's just one concept, but that's part of that overall kind of deeper dive once the urban growth boundary. The boundary is just kind of a boundary. It's just out there. But there are other elements and layers to that are required actually to make it really work so that somebody doesn't come in and say, well, great, I'm in the urban growth boundary, but then to have this huge burden on them to figure out, well, how do I execute this in terms of what this looks like? And that's where the concept planning comes in.
Okay, so am I to understand then the biggest concern of the people who have these farmlands who might be making some long-term planning for their estates is having a partnership with the city to help with development, to bring out the utilities, to bring out the roads, so that there's value to the land that way? Because I wasn't fully following up to that point.
Yeah,
okay, now I think I get it.
It's vital for that, and I would really highly suggest that you organize those property owners, find a leader to those properties and work with them. This time, really work with them. The fact that didn't happen the last time cost the city greatly.
And so noted. I mean, I think at this point, people are listening, and I think they're digesting, because it's a little bit of a shock when, 39 years have gone by, but if you're out in the county and you get a postcard from the city, I think they're digesting that whole issue. And some people are not really stoked about coming into the city. Other people are raising their hands. And part of our lens is we've asked them in the postcard specifically and during the meeting, we want to know, are you or are you not interested in coming into the city? That's the first lens at this point. That's an important element as we get through this process. It's one of many factors involved in this decision-making process. There's absolutely the need for what the city has to grow in the next 20 years. But I think also we want to know, what are we dealing with here? Are the majority of people, we don't have a sense of that. Are the majority of the people favoring this? We didn't have a raise of hands. It was really more, it was a hodgepodge of it was very much a blend, and some people didn't even say anything. but they were all very like participatory in the process. And we sent out a frequently asked question, which was, we handed that out to the people that came so they would understand that in the context of this. And so I think my hope is that we see many of those people tomorrow night that are going to participate in that process, either for or against whatever their position is. We've invited them to participate in the process, because that is the future kind of Canby, is that land.
Yeah, you'll have that. There's nothing there that surprises me, but when we brought the map to the council, there was only, of the 400 acres, there was one property owner that did not want to be included in an annexation. Once everybody understood it, and the way we got them to understand it was to orchestrate them and really educate them. So
And once we haven't got to that point yet, so it would be way premature to make any assumptions at this point, because it's all over the map. I mean, I've gotten emails and phone calls from people, and they're all in different camps. It's a real, but obviously what we did was effective. I mean, sending this out, I mean, when they showed up, they just continued to come in, and it was like almost time to start, and was really worried we're going to run out of chairs. And
yeah, well, that worked better than the last time, because a lot of us didn't even get that letter.
yeah, and I think that was helpful for people. I felt that
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, they need to know.
We need to reach out to them. It's important for us to do that. I mean, it's their property. So we have to appreciate that and respect it in the process. But so I think that may be a significant increase in these summits because of what happened on the 6th, is my guess. Even if only, some reduced percentage of those people show up, it's a lot. I mean, and we were pleased with the outcome. I mean, it was one of those things that could have been really unruly, and they were very courteous. I mean, that group was super courteous. We appreciated that, because we were able to talk about, answer questions, and we gave a minor presentation. It wasn't a real detailed presentation, but, and try to answer questions, and said, we will have another one of these as well as what we're planning to do. That will again be for the property owners in the undesignated area, probably at the beginning of the year, when we start to refine this and bring them back in for more discussion.
I'd like to ask that as that information starts to trickle in, that we document the individual landowners, what their addresses are, and, the size of their properties, which we can pull from our own records, just so that we can map that out. Because we can, technology is pretty awesome these days. We can pretty easily overlay that on the map and see how many acres we have in these different zones of people who are interested to be annexed in versus not, and, kind of use that to help work with our totals of who's willing and able, and then where do we have a little bit more work to do in terms of.
And we're already working on that, and you're exactly right. I mean, that's critical from from our perspective is, what is that sentiment? And, of the 70 people, I mean, some people they own several properties, but we have not gotten tons of responses yet. So we're still waiting for that. But those that have responded, we're clearly identifying where those are at, and yeah.
Great.
Do we have any other comments or questions from the Planning Commission?
Just roughly about the needs a name zone outside the rural reserve. Is that, so was the rural reserve defined as just a border around the towns, and then the area beyond that, they figured, well, since you can't pass through this buffer area and you can't have a discontiguous city, urban growth boundary, then that is what it is, and just don't worry about it kind of thing?
There was, and this was way before my time, but my understanding is that there was an identification of lands that were within a 50-year time frame that would not be considered to be developed ever in that 50 years. We're now 38 years into that 50-year period. So there's 38 years left for those rural reserves to, and there was, I think, contiguous to your question, I believe the adjacency and contiguous nature of those properties were considered. There are some anomalies in there, like it's not a continuous boundary in some areas, and like what happened there, and I'm like, I have no idea, but it's weird. Like there's like some corners that like, I'm not sure how that boundary got established, but it was a legislative directive, is my understanding, that came out of that, which again, kind of is what it is. That's what we have to work with. And it's a big area. I mean, it's more than double the need, which means that the city in another 20 years beyond now would have the opportunity to come back yet again and probably have a build-out plan of some sort. So, so to the extent that the acreage there was really more like looking at possible build-out of what this community might be, at least on an acreage basis, it was not necessarily an inadequate plan. Some of the geographies become challenging because some land is really more suitable, and you can pretty much clearly what's adjacent to identify that probably will be continuous with that land use. And it's kind of odd, like, we have less on the east side than we do in the northwest portion of the city. And so that becomes, we have way more land than we possibly would need for, in my opinion, for what might be residential. We have a huge amount of land that's possible. And I think that part of that is what we need to look at is what is abutting and adjacent first, because that's, again, how cities grow. They're not supposed to leapfrog. It doesn't pay well for cities to, extend utilities out that doesn't serve a contiguous boundary. So that's one of those themes. I don't know exactly how they formed the rural reserve, but that line is pretty much in the sand, and it's not going to change in most of our lifetimes here.
And so pretty much the next urban growth boundary will probably eat up the rest of it.
It probably will. I mean, that'll be, the 2083 plan.
If they haven't legislated it away by then. Thanks.
Sure.
Commissioner Ebert?
Can we go back to slide 13?
Yes, yep. Do you have that land?
So you we need to go back to this.
So where should I go from here?
No, we can't. I don't know how to get back.
Should I just go through can I just do this? And yeah, I can do it. So it's NR.
It's on the desktop.
Can I minimize this? Oh, here it is. Isn't this it? It's right there. Key slideshow from beginning. Okay, 13. Yes, yeah. Commissioner Ewert. Is that not sharing? Okay.
That's okay. So this was dealing with the expansion area concept
Yes.
that you talked about, and then you mentioned the development and zoning code. So when we get to that point in that, is that dealing with the new codes that we'll be needing, or coding as a whole? Because there's a lot of in-house maintenance that we need to do to our present code.
We absolutely do. And I don't want to say we're going to hold off on doing a development code, for the entirety, waiting for that point. It's really more focused on the urban growth boundary codes that would be needed to complement that. So for example, in those expansion areas, and this is a question that will go through the comp plan, are the industrial designations the appropriate designations for that exist now? Should there be another industrial zone? Should there be more than 3 residential zones? And should those apply and be applied to the area outside of, in the current expansion or the expansion area that would be anticipated? Those are the questions that have not yet been answered.
So my question is that are you planning on, planning on developing those new areas, whatever they may be, and the coding, the zoning codes for those at that time? Or is the zoning code something that we're going to go back, we develop it, like, say there's a residential, we add 5 more categories to residential, let's just say. Do you want to do the coding for all of those at that time? Or is that something we're going to say, this is what we want, and then we're going to go back and do the work on that? I see that as a really expansive project just in that bottom bullet right there.
It is, and it's kind of intended to be, and it probably is going to be a blend of 2 things going on. One, I think part of it is, let's say we decide that we want to have more categories than 3 residential zones, and we want to expand that. That, in my opinion, will be clearly part of that review and added to that. Parks planning, which is going to be a public facility zone, clearly is going to be part of that. That would come through the Planning Commission. We clearly need a public facility zone in the city. We do not have one. Those are items there. We also need to do a holistic entire code update, which has been.
I guess that's what I'm kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Are we going to do the whole code update and pick up the new stuff? Is that the plan, or is it a plan to just, if we pick up new stuff, we want to develop a code to go with it at that time?
I think it's probably the later if there is a urgency to get, it really comes down to some patience on this. Like if people are impatient and say, well, all we're trying to do is get to the point of being able to annex and develop our property. I don't want that to drag out, so it could be individual code that is developed and you see those as more one-offs than a comprehensive entire code update. Part of the problem is we don't really know what the need is yet. And so to do a code update for the whole thing, because we'd need consulting assistance to do that, it would be somewhat premature. And so I guess
in your tossing that out there on that bullet, I can see that being something fairly reasonable if it's not too expanded. I mean, that could apply to industrial, commercial, residential, lots of different things. And that could that could turn out to be quite a large process. I'm just kind of was curious as to what your thoughts were on that.
And I think my preference would be to do more of the one-offs that are as needed and do as much of the code amendments as we can. We're kind of chipping away with those. Arguably, the efficiency measures that we're doing now are part of that code update as well. I mean, that's, the housing efficiency, so the cottage developments, the planning of developments, and more flexibility in residential being allowed on highway commercial. Those are part of that as well, and we're already working on those. I don't have a really great answer for you other than I think they probably will be more singular in their nature in terms of the need at that point. I totally recognize that we need to update the entire code. I'm just a little leery of derailing that process by doing an entire code update and say, wait, we can't actually we need to adopt the whole thing at once. Or if we do a code update at once, we need to be able to break it off into chunks and adopt those pieces, if it causes delays to.
Right. I could just see getting stuck in the mud, developing all those zoning coding and whatnot for our ideas. We could really get stuck in the mud in this process of trying to include that, saying that this needs to be done before we can move forward to do this. So I was just throwing that out there. The second thing is you threw, I don't know whether it was the next slide, but you mentioned update for new zone, i.e. parks, and you said fairgrounds.
So what I was saying is, probably going too fast. So currently, we don't have a public facility zone.
Right.
Almost every site that's a public facility, the fairgrounds is one of those, Public Works Center is another, all the schools are all zoned R1. They're not zoned, the golf course is also zoned R1.
Right.
So, which is odd. I've never seen this in any other jurisdiction. Like, that's really odd. One is, it feels like.
Churches are too.
Well, church, they're more residential though. They're not necessarily an anomaly in my opinion, because those blend in pretty well in residential areas and they're kind of an accessory to those. But I would, so my point is like, let's say that you have a public facility zone. I think it'd be a lot easier mechanically to set parameters around that for both permitting what's required under what thresholds and what are the processes for that, and to encourage master planning. So like if you do a master plan and go through that process, it's a lot easier to say, well, we've already addressed this holistically. You don't need to do 7 conditional use permits over the next 5 years. And schools are the same thing. I can't tell you how many conditional use permits the high school has.
Right.
And they're zoned R1.
Okay.
So, I mean, so it's that public facility situation that I think would be helpful for those entities, and I think it'd also give more predictability if holistically we could encourage more master planning. And so back to let's say we have a sports complex. I mean, I would love to be able to say that, underneath that, what are the allowed uses? That would be obviously one of them, and then there'd be parameters around what code sections would apply to that specific use. And then that would help that. It still may go through the planning commission if it's a large enough scale, but it just, right now we have like, everybody goes through a conditional use permit process, which I'm not sure if that's ideal. It's much more cumbersome to track, and like both from our end and the applicant's end, and it just would, I think it would streamline that process.
And just in question, the fairgrounds, when they're going to build something on the fairgrounds, it doesn't come before us, does it?
It does.
It does?
We have sovereignty over that land, yeah. So you will see the fairgrounds, and that hearing will be January 8th. And it has not gone, this is early information, that's our intention, and that's for the exhibition hall. So, yes.
Interesting. Okay,
So
very good.
they are not, just because it's owned by the county, it's in the city of Canby. That is actually incorporated into the city. That is not a donut hole where it's in the county, and there are some of those where there's some weird things, and that goes back to the voter-initiated situation that got removed. And I think at some point, some people didn't want to come in, but there are some outlying properties still in the city. If that was the case and they were in the county, under county jurisdiction, it'd be different. They're under city jurisdiction.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Don.
So in line with some of Dan's questions, so I'd like to see maybe a zone that's specifically for parks, or in the zoning code that we're looking specifically at trees, because right now we don't seem to have very strong codes addressing trees, retaining ones that are already here, putting new ones in, just making sure that as we develop, we aren't just turning into a lot of pavement and homes with no greenery in one of the greenest, most beautiful places on earth, because that would be sad. So I'd love to kind of incorporate that in a little. Early on in the presentation, you mentioned the Technical Advisory Committee. Who all is that comprised of?
It's going to be primarily a public agency transportation focus, so ODOT, Clackamas County, Public Works Department here for Canby. Those are the primary entities that are involved. So it's very technical transportation information. The crossover will be back to the Project Advisory Committee. So it's not like they're out on their own doing their own thing. There's going to be a crossover of that information, but it's a group that is very focused on technical issues and tied to the transportation system plan in specific.
And do we have any role in the transportation system plan, or is that?
Yes, the Planning Commission, both the comprehensive plan and transportation system plan and the urban growth boundary expansion will all come before this body for recommendation to the council. So in addition to this being the key point for housing, kind of the housing focus, that will be something that will come before the Planning Commission on that.
Okay, and in terms of the timeline, around when will the TSP items circle back to us?
So probably talking next year this time. Next year, it would be towards the end of the year. That's the anticipation, holding all things constant, which so far they have been. But that there's a ton of stuff going on next year. I mean, it's like, again, the pace has been pretty heavy this year. It's going to continue into next year. And the goal would be by summer, fall, that we kind of are pens down, and then we start to go into the hearing process, like late fall. And then we would go into the hearings around this time next year. We probably will be close to hearing, I would say this is probably about right. We're in November, and the hope is that by December, which would be council, that they would have approval of the comprehensive plan and transportation system plan.
Okay, so when you're talking about hearings, that's just presentations to us, for us to be reviewing?
There would be, how we structure that is going to be, we haven't given that full consideration. Is it going to be everything all at once, or are there going to be components that are reviewed separately by each body? We haven't figured that out. I mean,
I'm not trying to pin you to
it's a
time
great
frame, it's just, I
So-
wasn't sure how it ties
It's a
in.
great question, and that also gets into the exact time frame. Like, if we parcel out, the more we parcel it out, some of that may be advantageous to parcel out. But it's a lot to do a comprehensive plan in one night.
It's a meaty document.
It
There's
could be,
a lot in there that could
and because
get
you're
some review and
addressing
conversation.
policies, and so that, I'm just brainstorming, if we did 4 or 5 chapters of the comprehensive plan, I mean, I'm not sure how we're going to do this. Great question, and we'll have to think about that.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, concerns? Commissioner Jarosh?
No, thank you. Nope.
Okay. Director Hardy, do we have any other updates or any other?
I think I've kind of oversaturated you guys tonight by giving you up. I've already kind of given you the updates that are forthcoming. As I have dates in the new year, we have not quite gotten there. I'll let you know. I mean, we're just trying to get to the end of the year. Oh, by the way, no, there's only one more planning commission. There's only one planning commission meeting in December. We have a planning commission November 27th, and December 11th is our last planning commission meeting of the year, because the next planning commission falls on Christmas Day, and none of us will be here for that.
Yeah, we like you guys, but
No presents for for anyone here. So, and then we're back into it. There's a number of we're going to start to see mixes of applications in as well. There, land development applications are on the horizon as well. Not at the pace that we had a year ago, but they're starting to come back, and so you'll see some of that as well.
The only other thing I wanted to ask was, I know we were talking about all the code updates and whatnot. So coming into the new year, will we be able to take any subject of our existing code and just work on it in between, like starting in January or February?
Yes, I think part of, we need to bring back fences. I know you guys, this is not a favorite topic, but the fence code does need to be addressed, and we are getting some pressure for that. So it's been hard to put it on the plate because there's a lot going on, but yeah, that's one of them. I don't know how far we're going to go. I think we talked about administrative variances and, minor variances. That is another topic that I'm hoping that we can advance as well. I think there's a need for that because our current code throws people right into a full-blown variance very easily, which most jurisdictions don't, over something rather small on deviation. So those two are ones I'm aware of. I mean, I'm aware of many other ones, but in terms of that, with all the other comprehensive plan stuff, it's probably about what we can add in.
could we potentially consider addressing the alley concern?
Yeah.
And give me the details again on that, though.
Really just, is it going to be defined as a road for as narrow as it is, and the fact that it can't be developed with sidewalks and parking and potentially drainage and, yeah, that's all of it. It's so narrow. I don't think we should be considering them roads for development because of the drainage and the narrow space that they are. So I'd love to just investigate that a little bit more.
And so instead of calling them roads, giving them some other
A true alley.
definition.
designation,
Okay,
yes.
alley, okay, and a definition.
Yeah, because from a development standpoint, I think we need something that firmly distinguishes
And
alley from
fencing
road.
comes in hand in hand with that.
Yep.
Coming up on an alley, you can't see because there's a fence 6 foot tall right up to it, and you can't see, especially if cars are parked.
Yep.
So that those two go hand in hand, in my opinion.
And many of them are very close to schools, which is a concern from a safety perspective for the community.
And let me add that onto the list. And that might not necessarily have to be a super deep dive if it's more a definitional issue. I'm hoping that some of this out of the TSP, to be quite honest, we can start getting into some of this stuff that, that is pertinent. Those are like cross-section issues. And that, again, I don't exactly have the timing, but there's a cross-section piece of the TSP, like what are those? And is that where we want to continue with where we're going? I think most of them are complete streets, meaning you've got sidewalks, bike lanes, and road width to accommodate all modes of travel. That's, of course, an alley is not going to do that. But like that, there's a cross-section discussion that I'm hoping that would be fruitful as well. I'm really interested in what Canby Fire has to say as well, because they're a significant player in some of this stuff.
Yeah, as a one-off, they seem to be okay with it, saying, in an emergency, we can take a corner and we can get back there.
Yeah.
But when you're looking into just allowing development of that land, if every single parcel did the same thing as that 5-plex that we approved a few months back, then I'm not sure that they would feel as comfortable with it.
Gotcha. And I've added that on as another item.
Okay.
That was it. So
Good to go?
unless you guys have other things. So November 27th, back here, housing, so we'll be doing housing efficiency measures, a work session. December 11th, housing needs analysis. Those will both be lively conversations leading us into the next year.
Very good. Okay.
Tomorrow at the police station?
Yeah.
Oh,
Tomorrow at the police station, 6 PM. Please, I would love you all to be there. I think it's important. And if you're available, please show up. Hopefully, we'll have enough chairs and tables out there that we're borrowing from other facilities to bring out there. So, please show up, and the public is completely encouraged, the community is completely encouraged to participate.
good. Barring any other comments, going once, going twice, I will entertain a motion for adjournment.
Move we adjourn.
I second that. I don't know.
We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All against?
Aye.
All right, we are adjourned. Thank you, Canby.